speaker of the night is Steve Weis, who is going to talk to us about crypto projects that might not suck.
Thanks a lot. So hi everyone, my name is Steve Weis, and my background is in crypto, so I was, oh, can you hear me now? Yes, I have a crypto background, and I'm currently working at a startup called PiCrypto. We're working on some pretty interesting crypto-related problems. And today, as Nick said, I'm going to be talking about some crypto projects that might not suck. And to give a little idea of what I'm going for here, I'm not here to bash on anybody's crypto projects. I'm actually interested in learning about new things and kind of did this exercise to see what's out there that I might not know about. So as I go through this talk, as I mentioned, my goal is trying to learn about new projects, find out who's working on them, kind of the status and where it is in its development life cycle. I'm going to present a number of projects here. Most of them you'll be probably somewhat familiar with. There might be some new ones. Things that I kind of consider as experimental or new or maybe just not battle tested. I've got this little radioactive logo. And I've tried to cite people who seem like they were the project leaders or kind of the originator of it. I'm sure I've left people off, so apologies in advance if I omitted anyone who probably deserves credit. It's kind of based on what I found on the web. So a little bit on the methodology of how I came up with this list. I started out with a completely unscientific survey of sending out a Twitter request for submitting some project ideas, posted some mailing lists, and got about 1,300 views on the form I put up. Of those, about 110 different submissions, and of those, about 90 of them were actually unique. So some things got nominated multiple times, and kind of above that list, I went through and picked ones that I liked or I learned about or wanted to talk about. So leading off with the project that kind of got the most popular votes and things that I think that people feel pretty good about is Openssl systems from Moxie Marlinspike. So this originated as a open source messaging and phone app. It was acquired by Twitter several years ago and is now an open source project with a Openssl Foundation working on it. And essentially, they have got two apps, TextSecure and Redphone. TextSecure is a OTR-like protocol that has some nice key ratcheting features and some nice technology. It's completely open source and has been open source from day one. In contrast to some of the other messaging apps that have come out recently, which might either be a closed source or have like a client that is open source, but then their server side is closed source. This has been this has been open source client-side crypto from day one. Redphone does voice encryption of voice calls, so it's using kind of standard VoIP protocols, and again has been open source from day one. So I think that these are real good role models for projects where they've kind of been available for public scrutiny from the start and have generally been implemented well and kind of had a lot of scrutiny before they were put out there for use. Close second, something people liked a lot and came up a lot was Knakal. This is the networking crypto library, and so it originated with DJ Bernstein and Tanya Lang and Pierre Schwab. And essentially is a very high-speed, easy-to-use library that implements a suite of crypto tools, so things like Salsa 20 and some Curve 25519 and different primitives that are pretty performant across a variety of platforms. Something that is done well in this library is that they really put a lot of attention to side channel attacks and made it so that there's no kind of dynamic memory allocation or data-dependent branching. So it's been really designed to be resistant to side channel attacks and cache timing attacks from day one. Related to that is libsodium. So this is an effort that is trying to take this Knakal library and making it portable and cross-compatible so you can use it on a variety of platforms. I think this originated out of OpenDNS with Frank Dennis being one of the people working on it. I'm not 100% sure about that, but both of these were cited by multiple people as projects they thought didn't suck and that were actually written well and getting some adoption. So in this process, a lot of people nominated some of the old standbys. So surprisingly, out of the 1,300 views on the page, only one person actually submitted either PGP or GPG. I'm including it here because unfortunately it's like one of the only things we have to use for a lot of applications. So when it comes to email encryption, PGP is still, still the best of breed, which kind of says a lot about the state of the art. OpenSSH, I think this kind of falls in the same category as OpenSSL, which I'll talk about next. It's something we use every day and that we really depend on. And I think it's kind of like this workhorse open source project that has been out there, has tons of uses, and may not be getting the kind of support and scrutiny that it actually needs, since we rely on it very heavily. Tor, obviously a lot of people interested in Tor, using it, getting a lot of attention with things like Silk Road and other kind of popular exposure in the media. And then finally, I included OTR. So this is the protocol I mentioned that a very similar derivative is used in TechSecure. This is a messaging protocol and kind of an interesting project that I saw recently that is implementing OTR and XMPP over Tor hidden services. This is Invisible IM. So I don't know too much about that. It's fairly new, but kind of looks like an interesting effort, and some pretty good people working on that. SSL, OpenSSL libraries. I had to include this one, so I do include OpenSSL here, despite all the issues with Heartbleed and other kind of bugs coming up. I think that whole incident really showed how much we rely on this library. So many people were hit by it and discovered it's out there in embedded devices and on 20 different platforms and architectures. It's really become kind of integrated in a lot of people's critical infrastructure. And what this really showed is how little support there was. It was like they've had thousands of dollars of support in a year for what's pretty major product. The good news of coming out of this is I think there's been a lot more attention and kind of larger companies pledging to support OpenSSL. One thing that came out of it was the LibreSSL. So this came from the OpenBSD team, and they're essentially tearing out big chunks of OpenSSL, doing code reviews. I really suggest looking at their code reviews because they're really funny, just how snarky and they are. So this is a pretty interesting effort. I know that they released one of their early releases a couple days ago. Turned out to have some random number generation issues, but so they're not immune to the same things that other libraries are, but I think it's a good effort. I think Adam is involved with the third one on there, Boring SSL, is that right? Yep. So Adam's involved with this third one, Boring SSL. It's Google's own fork, and I believe it's incorporating some of the LibreSSL changes along with Google's own internal changes, and is intent. Okay. Hopefully we'll be incorporating some of Google's own changes in there, but is intended to be boring, and I think if you want to talk more about it, Adam's here to, you can talk to him after the talk. So, kind of moving along, jumping around some different topics. Several people brought up some of the JavaScript Crypto libraries, and there's a lot of controversy over JavaScript Crypto. You can see a series of blog posts from a variety of people talking about how it's unsafe, shouldn't do it, kind of like been rehabilitated recently, but of these libraries out there, the best breed seems to be the Stanford JavaScript Crypto library. It came out of Dan Bonet's group at Stanford, and I think Mike Hamburg worked on it. He gave the talk at the last meetup, but it's been around for several years, gotten kind of good origins and well-written, fairly well-written to start with, and is being used in some products out there. One of them I mentioned is this one, Krypton, and I believe they had an audit that didn't look at the SJCL specifically, but did find some issues with it and address some of those issues, so it's getting more scrutiny, kind of getting adopted out there. The second one on there is fairly recent. It's a JavaScript library out of Microsoft, and interesting thing about this is that they've really gone to great lengths to ship it with a lot of test vectors and code to actually make sure that it's performing the way it should be. So I downloaded this thing and it expanded to like 900 megs or 800 megs, and most of that's just test vectors. So it's like 9,000 lines of code and then just hundreds of megabytes of test vectors. Unfortunate thing, it's the non-commercial license and for research or non-commercial use only. So it's not really something you're going to be able to incorporate in a product legally, but might be worth looking at as a kind of reference. Kind of in line with the JavaScript Crypto are some of the efforts around incorporating more crypto into the browser. So about a month ago, Google released a kind of alpha version of a product or project called End-to-End. And this is an open PGP implementation in a Chrome extension. So I think when they looked at this, there are some other open PGP implementations out there. They found them lacking, so they've kind of done a clean slate implementation of it, packaged it in a Chrome extension, and the idea is that this will be something you could very easily integrate with Gmail or other sort of web apps. So that's been published pretty recently and has some pretty good people working on it, Drew Hintz and Eduardo Vela. Web crypto, this is somewhat controversial. So this is a proposal out there to build some crypto functionality into the browser itself with hooks that you could call from JavaScript or from other scripts. And some of the controversy about it is that last time I looked at it, there was a lot of like kind of low-level crypto cipher modes and different block cipher schemes rather than kind of giving it a simple interface. But regardless, it's out there. Again, this came from Ryan Sleevey at Google and Mark Watson at Netflix. So it's out there. They're kind of going through the public review stage. So a lot of people have opinions on it, but it could potentially be very useful for browser-based crypto. I did see one project called PKI.js that's implementing some of the PKI standards using the web crypto interface. So that might be X509 type things and other different functionality that will be using those libraries or the interface. A couple online storage projects, or in this case products that came up. So both of these are open source. Tahoe LAFS is this least authority file system. So it's both the project and there's a least authority systems company. It's essentially distributed provider independent storage. And this originated with Zoko Wilcox Hearn. It's been around for several years, I think like maybe 6 or 7 years. Got quite a bit of scrutiny. I know they had some audits, so it's fairly well looked at. And as I mentioned, he's trying to commercialize as a product, so they probably have some commercial users. Tarsnap is pretty much like a one-man project from Colin Percival. He's pretty well known in the kind of PiCrypto area. It's an entirely client-side encryption that's open source, and it's not just open source, but you actually have to build it to use it. So it's pretty unusable for most people, but you have to build your client to actually use the service. And it's just backed by Amazon S3, but he's also operating that as a commercial company. Jumping into a few libraries that came up that I want to mention. So Crypto++ is a real old one. I think I remember it from the late 90s. It might even be earlier than that. But it's a pretty fully developed C++ crypto library. The developer, Wei Dai, he kind of comes up as like the top candidate for being Bitcoin Satoshi Nakamoto all the time because he's worked on cryptocurrencies, he's implemented all his crypto, but he denies it. But its library been around a long time. I don't know how much actual auditing or scrutiny it's gotten or if it's being used in many production systems, but it's been available for quite a while. Go's got a crypto library as well. Obviously Go's more recent. They're building quite a bit of functionality. I think Kyle Isom from CloudFlare has been working on that. He's over there somewhere, so he can probably tell you more about it. Go's generally had pretty good implementations. I haven't looked too much into this one specifically, but I included it because I think it's probably pretty good quality. Tooting my own horn a little bit, so Kezar is essentially a wrapper that sits on top of other crypto implementations. So things like the JCE or Openssl itself or PiCrypto. And it originated with Ben Laurie, who's still at Google. I worked on it for a while, and then also I think Devin Lundberg, right there. He also worked on it as well as many others, so it's kind of an open source project. I think Google's using it in some Android applications, but it's been going for a while, and I think there's some efforts now to do a version 2 that's going to be kind of a reboot. They may break backwards compatibility to kind of fix some of the design issues that have come out over the years. So it's still an ongoing effort and getting some use by a variety of companies. Including a couple that are more recent. So this is one that I came across through this effort was some of the different Python libraries out there. So PiCrypto, kind of heard some complaints. It's maybe not as fully baked as it should be. So this is an effort from these guys, Paul Kerr and Alex Gaynor, to kind of build a Python crypto library from the ground up, try to have good practices. Again, fairly new, something I learned about recently, but it is an effort that came up out there. And also, fairly recently, is this ECC lib from Microsoft. So this is a elliptic curve library. I don't know the license it's released under, but they're essentially trying to put out a library with some safe curves that's also resistant to some side channel attacks. So something I haven't looked too much at, but it might be an interesting project if you're interested in elliptic curves. Jumping a little bit, so a couple kind of messaging and content apps. Another project from Adam is Pond. So three of the warning systems. So he says it's triple radioactive. Fairly new project, fairly experimental. The idea here is that things like OTR are more for synchronous communications, chat-based, and we don't have a good asynchronous communication, so kind of like an analog of email. And this is something that Pond's trying to tackle and build a secure way of doing asynchronous communication. Cryptosphere, it's a P2P content publishing system, and the author's here as well, Tony. And also fairly new, probably needs a couple radioactive symbols, but this is built on Knakal and Ruby, so it's kind of modern tools and modern libraries, and has some analogs in the past, but is a new project, or a relatively new project out there that kind of allows secure publishing of P2P content through peer-to-peer networks. Also, a few more community efforts came up. So one that I think's been pretty well known is this OpenCrypto audit project. And this is the group that audited TrueCrypt. So it's pretty good pedigree of some of the people involved. I think their goal is to have more audits like this of open source projects. I think it's a very good community effort and something that people in industry, kind of individuals, can get behind things like this. Better Crypto, this is a set of guidelines I found out there for hardening more like applied crypto. So if you're like deploying SSL or kind of using a lot of the tools out there, it's basically a guide to some of the best practices of how to use that. Password hashing competition. This is one I think is interesting because in the past we had these AES competition, SHA-3 or whatever the current hashing competition is, and compared to those that came from NIST, this kind of came from the community. So a group of people got together and wanted to come up with some replacements for PiCrypto or SPipeD and decided to have a contest for it, and I believe this is still ongoing. But I think it's a good model and one that we might want to consider when a time where NIST's kind of credibility is eroded. Having these just come from the community and have these kind of open contests. And then finally, Safe Curves. This is an effort, again, from Dan Bernstein and Tanya Lang to specify some criteria and basically judge, variety of curves on their safety. So they have published some different ways of measuring curves and deciding whether they have certain certain security properties. A couple more experimental toolkits I want to mention. So these implement some more kind of recent crypto developments, things like bilinear maps or identity-based encryption, pairing-based crypto. There's a couple of them. One's called Relic, and there's also one called pairing-based crypto at Stanford. I think Relic's been more maintained and updated. And essentially, if you want to play with some of these new kind of constructs and look at some of the newer protocols that are in the literature, these might be a good place to start. Charm's a rapid prototyping toolkit. So this is basically some Python bindings to some C implementations, and again, provides some of these functionality of like bilinear maps. It also has some ways of like generating multi-party protocols, and originated out of Johns Hopkins. So this is Matthew Green and his group of students, and they've taken this and implemented a couple different signature protocols and protocols on top of this Charm library. And I think they're going to be working on some efforts to expand it and try to make it more of a baked library that could be used in production. Kind of coming near the end, a couple more miscellaneous projects that came across. So Crypto is a domain-specific language. And the idea here is that you want a very structured way to specify things like hash functions or other kind of cryptographic primitives. It's more targeting hardware implementations, but thought it was interesting to see that and kind of a way of making it easier to formally analyze crypto implementations.
That's not radioactive. That's been a commercial product forever.
Okay. Yeah, crypto, it's from this company Galois, which I know they do a lot of DARPA grants, so could very well be used by governments right now, so maybe it's not radioactive. It's new to me, so.
If you hang around the Haskell world, they're quite common.
Okay. Yeah, so I've heard of Galois for a couple years, but heard about this like a month or two ago, so could very well be much more baked than I know about.
It was just open source like 2 months ago.
Okay. So that might be one.
That might be why it's not.
Okay. This next one, SPipeD. I mentioned Colin Percival. I was talking about Tarsnap. He says, "Oh, you should really talk about this," so I included this as well. Essentially, it's a secure pipe daemon, and if you use SSH, it's kind of the equivalent of using SSH-L. He seemed to think that this is more important of his work, so I haven't looked at it too closely and actually just discovered it based on this. So on his recommendation, SPipeD is up there. And then kind of coming at the end, a couple libraries that are a little more experimental. So libsnark and snark, if I remember this correctly, it's for a succinct, non-interactive argument of knowledge, and this is for zero-knowledge proofs. And I think the lead author is Eli Ben Sassoon, and the idea here is you can prove that a program actually executed correctly with a short proof. So if you're running some C code, you can generate a proof and verify that that C code actually executed correctly. And I think one of the applications he's talked about this is for cryptocurrencies. So I think he talked to some Bitcoin conferences. You can probably find a video of that, but pretty interesting primitive, and it's nice that they've actually implemented it. A lot of academic papers, it just exists on paper. So libraries available. And then finally, libmacaroons. Macaroons supposed to be better than cookies, so this is a library to be a better version of cookies with kind of a distributed authentication authorization system, and originated with some group at Brown and has been implemented by, I think, a sole author, Robert Escriva. So kind of ran through these pretty quick. At the beginning of this, I can go back to it. There's actually a link. I saw people taking notes. You can download it. I'll open it up for questions now. That's all I have. Yep.
Are there any particular areas where you think where you'd really like to see new projects, or conversely where there are like plenty projects and someone else contributing better to contribute to something pretty out there?
Yeah, so the question is, are there areas where I'd like to see new projects? I keep, over the years, seeing again and again, like PGP implemented in the browser, and there's no real way for me to send encrypted email right now. I don't use Thunder or whatever the Mozilla mail client is, Thunderbird. When I do send PGP, I have to load up this one mail client and just use it just for that. So I just feel like that's a big gap, and we're still talking about it 20 years later. So maybe not even email, maybe it's a new asynchronous messaging, maybe it's something else, but.
You know about BitMessage?
I've heard of BitMessage. I don't know too much about it.
It's sort of a replacement for email where the servers have to be live all the time, and so it not only encrypts the content, but it assures the routing, and so it resists traffic analysis, and it's bitmessage.org. It's written in Python, and it's kind of radioactive.
Okay, so I'll check that out. I wasn't familiar with it, so it's a BitMessage and apparently radioactive. But yeah, I think looking at new models and not necessarily being stuck with kind of legacy email, it might be a way forward. Yep.
Do you think the new Gmail API would open up that sort of thing? Is it possible?
I saw the announcement. I don't know too much about it there, but I think the issue is where you're actually doing the encryption. So you still need to have something on the client side. So that's where I see something like end-to-end being interesting, where just browser extension. I need to trust my browser, but that might be acceptable for email encryption. But yeah, it could tie into if there's APIs that make it easier to integrate rather than have it kind of bolted onto the existing interface. That might be interesting. Yep.
Yeah, so I noticed there was a lot of, like, most of those were nuclear symbols, and it got me thinking about how the crypto community, like, nobody wants to be that guy who makes the project that everybody starts using, and all of a sudden there's a huge side channel check, right? Even if the math is sound, there's a big problem with it. And it got me curious because OpenSL
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and like, you know, even my title of my talk, like I'm not willing to say these are great crypto projects. Like I'm hedging my bets and like, might not suck. So, I think the issue is that there's not a lot of people who go out and actually review these things. So there's a lot of projects that start up and they're kind of like one guy doing it, or you know, even OpenSSL, they've got like 12 people on the page. It's really, if you look at the mailing list, it's like a few people. So they're doing all their own code reviews, and it's not that fun to go audit a bunch of somebody else's code. So, you know, to answer your question, why are there so many projects which we're not really happy with? I think it takes a long time. So, you know, PGP's been around 20 years more, and we're still pretty happy with it as is, except for like the usability. But it takes a long time to be. Yeah, it takes a long time to build confidence in it and really trust it. And it's like, I think that it's just a slow-moving field, and you know, some of these new projects, it might be a number of years till they're adopted, or you know, it takes some large backing, like you know, Google's or Apple's or whoever coming in and actually allocating resources to it and having people working on it. So you know, I see involvements of like industry as a very positive thing in a lot of these projects, because you know, otherwise it's a guy who's doing his free time or a girl who's doing her free time, just you know, whenever they can, and it's not necessarily getting audited by outsiders. And so I'd like kind of seeing the open source and the industry working together on a lot of these things. Yes?
What are the criteria to get on your list?
It was me picking things on there. I think I have some biases. So like I said, things that had like kind of big companies involved, I tend to see them as more baked. I think I mentioned I left off cryptocurrencies just because there's like 50 of them, and I don't know what the interesting ones are. And
I think maybe that's part of the reason there's so many projects is because we don't really have a set of objective criteria that we can use to evaluate other people's projects. And so maybe that is something to think about, or us all to think about. Why can't we work more together? Why can't we figure out which projects are a good starting point and work together on those projects? Because I do agree. It seems like, in my experience, everybody wants to go off and start their new thing because they're not happy with the current stuff, but it's hard to understand what the specific objections are other than the code sucks, right?
yeah, so I think it's easy to start things. It's hard to actually make them good. So, and I think it's also kind of hard to get involved in existing projects. So, you know, I've sent patches to the OpenSSL list. They don't get incorporated, so I'm not going to spend too much time fighting it. But you know, it's not necessarily easy to get in, and I don't know what the answer is. But you know, I think that some of these community efforts might be a good start. So, you know, NIST has specifications. There's a bunch of European eStream and all these things that have their own specifications. There's no reason you can't have equivalent of like password hashing competition where just, you know, individuals get together and say, yeah, we think this algorithm's good. We think this is good. And that's kind of happening with some of the elliptic curve stuff. And I think DJ Bernstein's been a real, you know, proponent behind that, of like just putting out his own set of specs and running with it and not having to necessarily be backwards compatible. So, you know, I think for a long time you kind of go with whatever the NIST standards are, and that might be changing. I think a lot more people are looking seriously at like Knakal. Yeah.
So NSS, Mozilla's TLS implementation, is that not on the list because it sucks, or is it just not on the list because it?
Man, I had to write some NSS code about 10 years ago, so I think that's why. Fair enough. So I'm not as familiar with it where NSS is today, to be honest. So it's more of, I pick things that I.
Because it looks like.
Well, I think that when people debate this, it just goes around and around, especially when they debate OpenSSL versus NSS. I think that both of them have their merits and demerits, and I think that there's room for improvement. I think that not many people are very eager to work on NSS anymore, and so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that it's
Yeah, I should mention too, there's a few other TLS implementations I didn't include that people did mention. I just, I think I tended to include stuff I was more familiar with. So there's like GNU TLS, and somebody said Polar SSL. I don't even know if that's open source, but
I think one thing that's interesting about NSS is that the OpenSSL vulnerabilities have gotten a lot of press, but there have been similar or worse vulnerabilities in NSS over the same time period. Even excluding atoms, there's still like a pretty long list. Um, and I think it's very interesting that we kind of stigmatize certain projects as soon as something bad is publicized about them. But there's a lot of other bad things that are happening quietly in other places, and also there's good things that are happening in those bad code, and vice versa.
I think that's something else too. Is kind of like the offensive side gets all the glory. So if you find the OpenSSL bug, you get your logo and all your press, and the guy's actually sitting there fixing it and pulling out the code. It's not really glamorous, and it's not necessarily that much fun, but it has to happen, and I'm glad it is now. Yeah.
So one of my passions is crypto reporting, and I feel like they tend to report on what's new. And I feel like something like this, like this sort of survey, would be really awesome for journalists. If you could actually see the info about like which projects are good. And like one of the main things I notice is pretty much everything you just discussed does not get reported or discussed in mainstream media aside from something like OpenSSL because of the problems. Not really why they're good.
So how about this? I'll put at this link. I'll put something on GitHub that we can, people can contribute to and have to send pull requests.
Yeah.
So I'll take this thing, just put it in a, mark it down or something, and kind of community edit it and have it like the ongoing list of things that might not suck.
Yeah, yeah. Have you thought of building this out as more of like an information resource, maybe doing press releases?
I don't have time for that. This is just for fun tonight. Like, I'm not really going to do too much more. Yeah.
I was just going to ask that, like, the only press you're ever getting for a crypto library is new or if there's a problem with it. It's not like, if I want to start contributing online, I'm going to take that for like a glamour kind of shot. I don't want to work on that.
Yeah, I guess the other issue too is that like when you're talking press coverage and kind of the glory, it's like the thing that I find frustrating is some of these closed source messaging apps go out and kind of raise, $20–30 million on something that you can't audit, and they're claiming it's, military grade encryption and their servers are in Switzerland, and it's BS, but that's, they're marketing it right, and they're, getting some attention. It'd be nice if they also kind of did the tech secure approach and were open source from day one, but I don't know why they're not. Yeah.
I know like a lot of those options that you were talking about aren't really for consumers, but do you have anything to suggest as far as a replacement for TrueCrypt? I mean, I don't know what this one's project is on, but I'm guessing since they're warrant canary, I guess a lot of options are that people are looking for options on that.
I really don't know. I think TrueCrypt, like, it was the option because it was cross-compatible. I think that's what's really missing, is that there's other things for Linux. There's, BitLocker, but nothing that's like portable. So I don't know of another solution out there that you can drop in replacement for it. And it's such a bizarre thing. Like, I don't know what the developers are thinking, but if it's actually like a NSL canary or if they're just cranky, but I don't have anything to really say about TrueCrypt because it's such a weird way to go out. Okay, well, thank you very much. This is fun, and appreciate you.
All right, well, first of all, I'd like to thank the speakers. Let's give them another round of applause. This is great. So, yeah, it was this last talk was really interesting because so many people that Steve mentioned working on these projects are in this room. So this is a great opportunity for everybody here to, talk to the authors of their, favorite nuclear or not projects in crypto. So Here at Cloudflare, we're also really interested in crypto and different projects in security, as well as trusted computing, and we're looking for people who want to do these sort of things. So talk to anybody in an orange name tag if you're interested in something like that, and feel free to stick around, have another drink, and talk with your favorite crypto library or project author. And yeah, thanks for coming, and hopefully we'll have another one of these soon in a couple months. And